Thank you everyone for making it back after lunch. You guys are really dedicated, that's great. What I'm going to try and do in the next 10 or so minutes is just review global guidelines that are out there. And I really owe most of this talk to Soumya Gupta. Hopefully she's in the crowd, she's there, who did all the heavy lifting on it. And I call it a wiki presentation because basically what we did is we said, hey, we need the guidelines, and then a lot of people actually really came forward and contributed their published guidelines. So what we did was I'll give a little bit of background, some methods, and we looked at 72 countries, the ART guidelines for 72 countries, and then I'll present a conclusion. So what we did was, and there will be some comparison here, what we did is we kind of benchmarked according to the WHO 2010 ART guidelines. Now, this talk actually is a dinosaur talk I don't know how many years, maybe 4 or 5 years, we won't be needing to talk about all these CD4 cell counts, et cetera. But for the 2010 guidelines, we looked at the less than 350, and then we also looked at whether people were being treated for TB immediately, and pregnant women less than 350, and serodiscordant couples. And then there are no recommendations for ART in the 2010 guidelines, but we looked at that as well. We collected the guidelines from the websites. We contacted ministries of health. We contacted people working in the countries, etc. And then we reviewed them. And when I say we, it's actually really Soumya did the heavy lifting. So no need to get freaked out by the slide. There's a lot of countries here, etc. The main point here is that there are a lot of countries. You can see that there's a wide range in terms of when these guidelines were published. You can also see that some of them are more recent. Those are in yellow. And this is as of March 2013. So some countries have actually changed their policy even in that interim. Here is a list of all the countries that have, and we're focusing on TasP here, or actually TasP is the wrong word. We're focusing on ART greater than 350, and these are the countries that have policies that suggest that or recommend that ART should be given greater than 350, and you can see we looked at for asymptomatic people and then also serodiscordant couples. You know, the idea is just that there are many countries out there that are recommending it at this time. And so when you look at for ART for asymptomatic people, this is the basic list. And again, I apologize for the busyness, but the point being here is that there's actually a wide range of recommendations. Most of them are in the less than 350 range, as you see. Clearly, the countries here that are at the bottom, we need to move them up into the less than 350 range, and then very quickly we're going to have to move them up to the less than 500 range. And then you have countries, the United States and others. The United States is immediate. You have other countries that are less than 500, so that you can see that there are some countries that are recommending earlier ART. So we put this on a timeline, which we find to be an interesting way to look at this because time matters. And the countries up on the upper part of this graphic are ones that actually went or made recommendations ahead of the WHO recommendations. So, for example, the United States is at immediate. If you look at the upper right-hand corner, United States is at immediate. WHO recommends less than 350. And the countries below are at WHO recommendations or below that. And you can see that there's also a mix here in terms of when countries actually use the WHO guidelines and when they are out ahead of the WHO guidelines or behind, however you want to see it. So who cares, right? Well, actually, policy matters. Here's the ART coverage for Southern and Eastern Africa, and you can see basically red is not good and green is good, and you can see that coverage varies. And actually, this is correlated. We don't have that in this graphic, but some countries have just recently gone to less than 350. So it's, if you've just recently gone to less than 350, then it's going to be hard to get 100% coverage or even 80% coverage if that's not your policy. So then what we did was we looked at GDP. Okay, so does GDP matter? And actually, it is correlated. So and what you see on the left here is basically the ART eligibility, and on the right you see below on the x-axis you see the GDP, and you see that there's a clustering down. These countries are clustering down to lower GDPs. You see the United States up here, so they've gone to immediate, and then you see this clustering here. Now, there's a couple aspects of this that I'd like to point out. One is that you do see that countries that are poor, there's a clustering below the less than 350. So, or is this GDP? Is that related to what eligibility they have? But the other thing that I think is interesting here is that actually, just because you have a low GDP doesn't mean that you have to recommend less than 250 or below the WHO recommendations. So this is again same sort of analysis looking in terms of TB. Now remember, the recommendations here are all TB patients irrespective of CD4 count. So what we need to do is move all of these countries up into that upper box there. So we have a lot of work to do in that area. And this is for pregnant women. And again, these countries in the bottom, and this isn't meant to be offensive to any countries, and I hope we've got it right. Some of them are wrong. Probably the guidelines have been changed, but the idea is that we need to move those up, and then we will have to move them up again into the less than 500 when those guidelines come out. So here's a slide just to remind us about why policy is important, because if the policy is not on the books, it's hard to get funding, and it's hard to get funding if the policy is not on the books, and you get in this kind of chicken and egg type scenario. Now you've all eaten. If I've shown this before lunch, then you'd be hungry by now. And what I wanted to also just mention this in terms of option B plus. This was an issue for Malawi. I think when they were originally proposing option B plus, it wasn't part of any recommendations, and they had, I think, a bit of difficulty, safe to say, in getting funding for that. But what I want to show you in the next few slides, and these are borrowed from, and you've seen some of this, but this is borrowed from CDC, is that you can see in red, this is in mid-2011, no countries were really doing option B plus. They were thinking about, Malawi was doing it in green there. And then you see mid-2012, and now you see in green, everybody's moving towards option B plus. And I would argue that the policy, a lot of this actually predated policy, but the policy's catching up to what countries are actually doing in this area. And there is an issue between policy and funding. We have to realize that. Let's look at serodiscordant couples. WHO recommends ART, irrespective CD4 count, for serodiscordant couples. Oh, sorry. And you can see these are the countries that are on the books now for recommending ART for serodiscordant couples. Clearly, there's a lot of room to work in this area as well. And then we looked at GDP and ART coverage, and you can see that actually there's a low correlation between GDP and ART coverage, but again, you have that spread at the low GDP. So it's not, there's more to this than just GDP. We're in the process of doing a multivariate on this to try and take a look at some of the other factors, what's involved in coverage. It goes beyond GDP, but it's something important to look at. So limitations, clearly these are just the published guidelines, okay? So so what that means is that some countries don't ever update their guidelines, or very rarely, once every 10 years, but their practice may be different. Practice and program implementation, especially if there's a private sector, might be different as well. And then there may be other guidelines that we missed, of course, that's always a possibility, but we were pretty thorough. Conclusion, there's a big variation there. So you see some countries less than 500, some immediate, some less than 350, some below that. Most of them are less than 350, so that's good news. It's a dynamic process. The adaptation and the adoption of new policies takes time, but it's also dynamics ongoing. What I see from these trends is that we're moving towards earlier ART eligibility, and you have some that are recommending immediate treatment. You have others less than 500. When WHO goes to less than 500, that will further pull the group of countries up. And then the guidelines don't mention sex workers, MSM, or injection drug users, and I think that that's something that has been considered, but something that we may want to reconsider. And then what the timeline tells us is that, and what this talk should tell us, is that we need to accelerate all this. It shouldn't take 5 years from when WHO recommends something for a country to adopt it, because that slow adoption actually is also related to funding and also related to implementation. So one of the things at UNAIDS that we're going to try and work on is an acceleration of adoption of new policies as they come out. And also we need to support countries who are, for their epidemiologic context, who are thinking about being more aggressive than the current guidelines that are going on the option B plus path, or trying to do those sorts of things. We need to support them with helping them with policy, but also helping them get the funding to make that happen so that the policy can follow. So I want to thank everybody that helped, particularly Soumya and some folks from CDC, and also the inventor of the internet.